Good morning, students. So, welcome once again to the business law world. As already I have discussed with you all the essentials of a valid contract, as we are studying the Contract Act 1872. So, I think now you are familiar with the terminology of this particular act, that is Contract Act. So, it is very important whenever you are entering into a contract or you are making any agreement that you should be familiar with the essentials of a valid contract, because in the lack of the essentials of a valid contract, there is no sense of valid contract. And any party who is entering into a contract and there is a particular gap or there is a lack of essentials of valid contract, so that time that party cannot get the agreement enforced by the law, enforced by the act. So it is really very important when you are entering into a particular contract, you need to focus on the essentials. As already I have discussed with you all the different essentials of a valid contract, as offer and acceptance. As I told you that without offer, without offering, without acceptance or consent, there is no sense of the contract. And there are some other essentials as the lawful object or the capacities of parties, the proper consideration and the capacities of parties, and the certainty of the contract writing and registration. So today there is another essential of a valid contract, that is the free consent. As we know that once when a particular party is proposing or giving the offer to someone for a particular agreement, right, for any act, so that time that party is desiring to have the consent or the acceptance from another party. So what is the meaning of the consent? Because today we are discussing, or we are going to discuss about the consent or the valid consent, or what are the provisions as per the law of free consent and valid consent. So what is the consent? No doubt, consent as per section 13 of the Contract Act, this is the particular term which defines that two or more persons are said to consent when they agree upon the same thing and in the same sense. It means when there is a particular agreement, right, in that at the time of making any agreement, if the parties are not agreeing with the particular thing or they are not on the same page, so there is no particular sense of the consent. It means consent exists where both the parties who are entering into a particular agreement or the contract agree with the same thing in the same sense. For an example, suppose Mr. A is making a proposal to Mr. B for selling his house worth rupees 20 lakh for rupees, suppose 20 lakh, but another party doesn't agree with the same thing or is desiring to buy the property worth for rupees 15 lakh, right? So in that case, there is no same sense or there is no agreement with the same condition. Both are having the different meaning. So that time there is no free consent or there is no meaning of the consent, right? So as I told you, as per the section 13 of the Contract Act 1872, the consent means when both the parties are having the same sense with the same thing under a particular agreement or they are entering into a contract. Thus, consent involves the identity of the minds, right? And what about the free consent? Section 14 lays down that consent is said to be free when it is not induced or caused by the followings. So exactly what are these factors or what are these particular things? The very first is the coercion and second is undue influence, misrepresentation, fraud and mistake. So when we talk about the free consent, right, now you are having the sense of the consent, we come to the free consent. What is the free consent? When the parties who are involved in a particular contract and they agree with the same sense, with the for the same thing, that is consent. But if the consent is right, when the consent is induced or affected by these particular points, then we can see that there is no free consent, and in the lack of the free consent, the validity would be affected of the contract. So in order to make any contract valid, right, or you want to enter into a valid contract, because in future if there is a particular conflict, so that time you want to make your agreement enforced by the law, there is a need of the free consent. So in the lack of the free consent, right, or in the absence of the free consent, there would be no sense of the valid contract. So we have to see whether there is a free consent or not. So how will you identify that in a particular case the consent is free or not, or the consent is valid or not? So in order to make, or in order to identify the free consent, we should very carefully observe that the consent which is given by the party in the contract should not be induced by these particular points, that is the coercion, undue influence, misrepresentation, fraud and mistake. Further, definitely one by one we would be getting a particular knowledge of these points, exactly what is the meaning of coercion and what is the meaning of undue influence and others, right? So I think now you are familiar with the term consent, because after that we come to the free consent, and free consent is identified if it is not induced or affected by these particular points: coercion, undue influence, misrepresentation, fraud and mistake. Okay, so let me proceed with the coercion. So what is the coercion as per the Contract Act 1872? So as per the section 15, coercion is the committing or threatening to commit any act that is forbidden by the law, by the Indian Penal Code, right? It means if any act which is done by any person and that particular act has been forbidden by the Indian Penal Code, it means you are not allowed to act or for that particular act. So coercion is committing or threatening to commit. If any party is threatening that I will do it, okay, I will do it, or you are committing that particular act, okay, and that particular act is not allowed by the Indian Penal Code, so it would be a coercion, or it comes under the coercion. Or unlawful, if any party is detaining any property, right, or threatening to detain any property that will cause to the loss to anyone. Okay, so this is also a case, or this is also a particular example of the coercion. So coercion is that term which includes basically committing or threatening to commit particular act, right, that is to the prejudice to of any person. Okay, so whatever the intention, whatever the intention you are having, or the party who is entering into a contract, causing any person to enter into a particular agreement, it means you want, or we are just taking the example of any party. Suppose there are two parties, Mr. A and Mr. B. Mr. A is proposing a particular offer to Mr. B and wants that Mr. B accept or give the consent on that particular proposal. Okay, so what happens? Mr. B is not ready to give the consent. So in a particular manner, or Mr. A is trying to have the consent from Mr. B for that particular proposal through coercion. So what is the coercion? Coercion is that particular term in which Mr. A is trying to influence that person or to force that person, Mr. B, right, in this example, Mr. B, that you should do it, okay, or you have to give the consent. So coercion definitely is a term in which we have to identify that Mr. A or a party is committing any act or is threatening to commit any act which is forbidden by the Indian Penal Code. Okay, so unlawful if the person is detaining any property or is keeping any property with him, right? Or threatening to detain, and ultimately the detention of that property will cause the loss or is prejudice of any person. So whatever the intention, right? Whatever the intention is there, right? So we have to identify that particular act which is forbidden by the Indian Penal Code, and that act is done by anyone. So that is under the coercion. So the explanation to the section further adds that it is immaterial whether the Indian Penal Code exists over there or in a particular place, right? If there is no Indian Penal Code in a particular place, but coercion is there, right? So we have to identify that particular consent is effected by the coercion or not as per the section 15. If any consent which is given by the party under the coercion, it would be no free consent. Okay, so example of coercion, you can see a Madrasi gentleman died leaving a young widow behind him. The relatives of the deceased threatened the widow to adopt a boy, otherwise they would not allow that particular lady, right, to remove the dead body of her husband for cremation. So in that case, because the relatives are making pressure on that lady, right, in a way that they will not allow her to remove the body from that place for the cremation if she is not adopting a particular child. So in that case, suppose under the pressure that widow lady adopted a particular child and subsequently applied for the cancellation of that adoption of the child. So the court definitely will held that because the consent of that lady was taken under a particular pressure, under the coercion, this is the case of the coercion because the relatives threatened to commit a particular act of not allowing her to remove the dead body for the cremation. So this is the act which is under the coercion, and it was held in this particular case by the court that the consent was not free, rather it was induced by coercion. So we have to again identify through this example that in this case the lady was forced, right? How? Because the relatives threatened her that we will not allow you to remove this body from this place for the cremation if you are not going to adopt a particular child, right, as per their wish. So in this case, we can say because under the pressure, lady adopted the child, but subsequently that lady approached to the court and tried just to have the verdict in her favor by the court that I want this particular adoption cancelled. So no doubt the court will give the verdict that because this particular consent was given under the pressure, under the coercion, so there is no valid consent and this particular agreement or the contract would be voidable and would go in the favor of that particular widow lady. Okay. And you can take the example second. Mr. A threatens to shoot Mr. B if he does not let out his house. So Mr. A is trying to have the consent of Mr. B for letting the house by Mr. B, but B agrees. Okay. In this case, we see that B agrees to let out his house to Mr. A, right? But subsequently, Mr. B can deny for it, for letting out the house because he gave the consent under the pressure because the threatens was there the consent of Mr. B has been induced by again the coercion. So through this example, you can have the understanding of the coercion. If the consent is taken or induced by the coercion, it is not the free consent. And if the consent is not free, as I told you earlier, that if the consent is not free or induced by coercion, there would be no sense of the valid contract. So you have to be very conscious that if any case the particular consent is taken by the coercion, so that time it would be no contract, or maybe that contract is voidable, because the aggrieved party will approach to the court and will demand for the verdict in his favor or her favor. And there are some other points that we have to see whether this is a coercion or not, because threat to file a suit. No doubt, we observed under the coercion that a party can commit or threat for committing a particular act which is forbidden by the Indian Penal Code. But if anyone is giving the threat to suit that I will sue you, right, that person is threatening a criminal or civil prosecution, and right, so it doesn't constitute the coercion, because it is not an act forbidden by the Indian Penal Code. But if the threat is given to file the suit on the false charge, right, no doubt everyone is free to sue, everyone can approach to the court, but on the false charge, if you are threatening to sue, so that time it comes under the coercion, right? So we have to be very clear when we are observing there is a particular threat to suit. So if the suit is upon the false charge, or threat to suit is upon the false charge, so that time it is coercion. Otherwise, because it is not forbidden to sue anyone by the Indian Penal Code, so it is not the coercion. And another point is threat to commit suicide. Yes, sometimes you see that anyone can try to threaten by committing or by saying that I will commit the suicide. So in that case, what is the remedy, or what is the particular, what is the case? So neither suicide nor threat to commit suicide is punishable under the Indian Penal Code. Okay, so you have to focus on this particular statement, that neither suicide nor threat to commit suicide is punishable under the Indian Penal Code. Only an attempt to suicide, okay, only an attempt to suicide is a punishable under it, right? So we are clear on this particular point. For example, in a case when a person by threat to commit suicide induced his wife and son to execute a deed in favor of any other person in respect to any property, right, which they the property is related to the his wife and son. Suppose the wife and son, right, are having the right on a particular property, or property are possessed by the wife and son of that person, but the person is desiring to transfer or to make the transfer of that property from the name of wife and son to his any relative. So in that case, what would happen? Because the property's rights are kept by the wife and son, and the person is trying through commitment of the suicide. He is threatening that he will commit the suicide if the wife or son are not transferring the particular property in the name of any relative. So that time again there is a case of the coercion, and the transaction would be set aside, right, on the ground of the coercion. So this is the particular case of the commitment of suicide. Okay, so now you are clear with the sense of the coercion. Now next point, which is the undue influence. And if there is a case of the undue influence, if the consent is again induced by the undue influence, okay, just apart from the coercion, we are talking about the undue influence, the second point. So if the consent is under the undue influence, or consent is induced or affected by the undue influence, there is a case of the no valid contract. Okay, so contract is said to be induced by undue influence where the relations subsisting between the parties are such that one of the parties is in the position to dominate the will of others. What is the meaning? The meaning is that if any person is having such kind of the position that that person can influence others' will or can dominate or is having the power to dominate the will of others for any act, for doing any act, right? So that time we can say that the consent is taken under the undue influence. Okay. So what is the undue influence? When there is a particular relationship or the relationship subsists between the parties, right? Between the parties, and the one party is in the position to dominate, right, the will of others. Okay. So section 16 and subsection 2, a person is deemed to be in a position to dominate the will of other. How will you identify that this particular person is having the dominating power to dominate the will of others? So there should be a relationship, right? So what kind of the relationship we are talking about? No doubt 3 points are there, and one by one we can observe that where he holds a real or apparent authority over the other. If there is a real or apparent authority. For example, master and servant, police officer and accused. Because police officer in the case of any accused, so that time police officer is having the authority, right? So in that case we can say there is a case of the apparent authority, and the police officer is having the power, right, to dominate the will of others. It means if any consent is taken by the police officer from that accused person, so because the police officer is having the authority, right, to make that person imprisoned or for taking him in a custody, so that time there is a particular relationship, and by using this particular authority, if the person is taking the consent, so again there is a case of the undue influence, right? And second point, if we see here, you can read where he stands in a fiduciary relationship. What is the fiduciary relationship? It means the relationship of mutual trust and confidence, such as doctor and patient, guru, spiritual advisor, and disciple, father and son. Because in these cases you can see that there is a understanding, there is a mutual trust, and they are having the particular information about the other party. So we can say there is a fiduciary relationship, and they can influence, no doubt, because they are having the particular information or the reach of the information about the party, right? And the third one is where he makes a contract with a person whose mental capacity is temporarily or permanently affected by the reason of age or any illness, right? So if the particular party is not having the mental capacity, or the capacity mental capacity is weak or temporarily damaged or permanently affected by any reason, so that time we can say that there is a case of again undue influence. And now third one, as I told you earlier, that a consent should be free of the following points. If any consent is influenced by the coercion or undue influence and misrepresentation or fraud and mistake. So the third point is the misrepresentation. What is the misrepresentation, and how can a particular consent is affected? How will you identify this particular consent is affected or induced by the misrepresentation? So you can have a look on this particular statement, that a representation means a statement of fact made by one party to other either before or at the time of contract, relating to some matter essential to the formation of contract. It means if you are entering into a contract and there is a particular part which is very crucial to give a form to any contract. So if there is a misrepresentation or you are representing in such a way, right, that the party which is entering into a contract is influenced, right, or is induced with the intention that another party should give you the consent, it would be the case of the misrepresentation. For example, Mr. A says to B, who intends to purchase his land, right? So, what is the statement of Mr. A in this example? My land produces 10 quintals of wheat per acre. A believes that the statement to be true, although he did not have sufficient ground for the belief. Later on, it transpires that the land produces only 7 quintals of wheat per acre, right? Mr. A is telling to Mr. B that my land is producing or is more productive, right, or producing a particular quantity of anything, right, as for the example, wheat per acre, and he wants Mr. B to believe it, to believe on that particular statement, but subsequently it transpires that particular land they are talking about is not producing as per the statement. So in this case, we can say Mr. A is trying to have the consent from B through this particular misrepresentation. So this is the case of the misrepresentation, and it would be held that there is a no validity of the contract and the aggrieved party can make the contract or the agreement enforced by the law, as this is the case of the voidable contract. And now the case is of fraud. Sometimes we see that the consent is induced or affected by the fraud. So what is the fraud? According to section 17, fraud means and induce any of the following acts committed by a party to a contract or with connivance or by his agent with intent to deceive or to induce. So we have to focus on this particular term, deceive or to induce another party thereto or his agent to enter into a contract. If through deceiving or you are deceiving in any manner, any person, right, through any agent, or you want that another party should come into a contract. Okay. So if you are deceiving or you are concealing, right, any fact. So these are the 2 points through which you can easily develop the understanding of the fraud. The representation that a fact is true when it is not true. So you, the particular party who is proposing, right, a particular proposal and is knowing that exactly what is the fact, but he is trying to conceal that fact. You know that this is a fact, but you are trying to conceal that information from another one. So when it is not true, one who does not believe it to be true, thus a false statement intentionally made is fraud. Because in this case, the particular presentation or representation is given over there intentionally over a particular fact that is really not exist over there, or the fact is not true. And B point, the active concealment of a fact by a person who has knowledge or belief of the fact. And last but not least, it is the matter of the mistake. Mistake may be defined as an erroneous belief concerning something. So what kind of the error or what kind of the mistake we are talking about? Mistake of the law. Every citizen in the country is deemed to be conversant with the knowledge of the law of his country, right? Hence the maxim, ignorance of law is no excuse. If you say that I was not having the knowledge of the law and I committed that. So as we are talking about the mistake of the law, we know that as per the law, there is a particular statement that every citizen should be familiar with the knowledge of the law in the country or the knowledge of the law of that country. So if you want to take the advantage that we are not having the knowledge of the law, and that time you are having the consent by that particular type of the mistake, so there would be a case where the consent is not free and consent given by the party would be induced by the mistake. So now you are familiar that if any consent is induced by the following, following it means by coercion, undue influence, fraud, mistake, misrepresentation. So that time we can say there is a particular case when the consent is not free. So in the absence of the free consent, there would be no sense of the valid contract. So I think now you are clear with the today's topic. Thank you very much.